We're here to discuss the 1099s, specifically the miscellaneous and the NEC, because those are the ones that we utilize most frequently. And the reason we like to talk about these and get these out to people is because as a business owner, you are reporting to the IRS the services performed by your vendors that you've paid. The IRS then does a matching with those 1099s to make sure that that income is reported on the recipient. So that's why it is important to the IRS, because it's a matching process. There is penalties as well if you fail to file 1099s, and we'll go through those later. Right now we'll just kind of go through each of the forms in detail, along with some timing items and penalties and who the recipients are, that type of thing, to get you a little bit of information as to what needs to be filed, when, and how. And there are many information returns. Among them are the 1099 interest and 1099-C and 1099-Ks. There's W-2s, 1099 dividends, but we're going to discuss the 1099 miscellaneous and NEC in detail, because those are the ones that are widely used. And so in general, both of the forms are very similar in some instances. What's on the form is different, but who they go to and the dollar amount and what types of services, the timing, are very similar. So we're going to go through some general information, and then we'll go through some specific information. So the 1099 miscellaneous and NEC is used in your trade or business to report services for recipients that typically are individuals, sole proprietors, partnerships. There are some exceptions where corporations are included, and we'll go through those. Typically, as you can see, there's the services can range. It's a wide range of services: rents, actual services, awards. There's payments for healthcare, medical, proceeds to attorneys. The one thing to note is that, again, it's in your trade or business, so if it's a personal payment for an attorney, personal payment for services, those are not 1099. These, we're talking trade or business, Schedule Cs, businesses, those types of things. And again, there are some exceptions to the rule where some corporations typically do not receive a 1099, but the IRS has a few exceptions. Also, when in doubt, we like to report. You'd rather report the information to the IRS, and even if it is a C corporation and you're not sure, rather than having a notice come from the IRS that you failed to report. So over the last few years, there's been some progression in the 1099. It used to be just a 1099 miscellaneous form. And then in 2020, they changed the form, redesigned it, and they created the 1099 NEC form. They specifically pulled out the compensation for the independent contractors onto its own form, so that because it is filed and due January 31st to the recipient and to the IRS. The 1099 miscellaneous is due to the recipient January 31st, but to the IRS by February 28th. So there is a difference, and that's why they pulled them out and made them two separate forms, which kind of led to a little bit of confusion. And then as we go through the forms, you'll see what gets onto the different forms. They've also, recently for 2022, have made the form a continuous use form. So you can buy a packet of forms. It has, and we'll see it in an example, it does not have the date, the year. So if you have 2022 forms, you can use those for 2023, 2024, and so on and so forth, unless they change the form itself. Just a few, this is just a nice little guideline for a little bit of boxes and their general information that goes in the boxes and the limitations. I like to keep this handy so that if you get a vendor and you're not sure what box it goes into or what form it goes into, these are some general guidelines. And as you can see on the bottom, attorney's fees are different than gross proceeds paid to an attorney. So when you have a vendor as the recipient is the legal firm, which box and which form does it need to go into? So it will depend on what the service is related for. So we'll go through the 1099 miscellaneous form first and discuss the differences and the things that you should be aware of. But as you can see up there in the right hand corner, it says for calendar year 20. So you can then enter 22, 23, and so on and so forth. And again, they're going to use the same format unless they change the form itself. Then they will give a new 1099 miscellaneous, but so far they have not made any modifications, so the form that was good for 2022 can be used for 2023, and so on and so forth. So we're going to start and kind of go through some of the boxes, and then we're going to go through who gets them, because that is the same for 1099 miscellaneous as a 1099 NEC. So we'll go through the miscellaneous form, and then we'll go through the NEC. So in box 1 on the 1099 miscellaneous is rents. Now this is rents for building. It can be for property. It can be for a mixture of services and property. Sometimes you rent a bulldozer and you don't really rent the person, but it comes along with it. So you invoice somebody for a bulldozer and an operator, and so you'll have both pieces. And so you have to decide which form it goes on. The rental will go on this 1099 miscellaneous in box 1. Now if you were paying the operator a different fee and a different person, then that would go on a 1099 NEC, but the rent of the bulldozer would go in box 1 on the 1099 miscellaneous. If you have rents for, as you can see, it says rents for real estate for office space, unless paid to a real estate agent. But we have seen, and this is something that is good to know, is that if you're a property manager and you have to pay them to the owners of the property, those also are issued 1099 miscellaneous, box 1. And you would include sales tax if you paid the sales tax, so it's the whole invoice amount. You don't separate out the sales tax from the rent. Then box 2 is gross royalties of $10 or more. Typically this is copyrights, patents, trademarks, not the working oil interest. I have not seen this too many times. Then we have box 3 in the 1099 miscellaneous. Now, I like to call this the catch-all box, because by definition, this is filled out only if you know you need to issue a 1099, but you can't determine which box it goes into because it doesn't quite fit into any one of the other boxes. It might fit into this box. And as you can see, it's not subject to self-employment tax. So if it's an independent contractor, they typically are subject to self-employment tax. They would not go here. But some of the common items that we have listed are the prizes and awards, punitive damages received, certain payments for deceased employee wages, medical research study payments, and insurance salespeople. For an example, for the prizes and awards, this would be if you had you were given a prize, you won a lawnmower or something from your church. And it's not a raffle, because a raffle prize would go on a W2G. It was some sort of drawing, or they just picked a parishioner. You didn't have to pay anything to get a ticket. You just received this benefit. If it was more than $600 or more, it would go in this, you get a 1099 miscellaneous for the price, for the fair market value of that lawnmower. So obviously you didn't receive cash, you received an item. For, deceased employee wages, the one thing to note is that you could have to issue a W-2 and a 1099 in the same year that they passed, but in the year after passing, then it would only be a 1099. It would not be both. So there are some specific rules regarding that, but any earnings that they made before they passed would go on the W-2. Potentially there could have been some wages that were paid after they passed that would go on a 1099, but there is a separation because you also have Social Security wages go on the W-2, but the compensation also could go on a 1099. So you got to look at the rules and when they passed and what they were earned. Then there is box 4. This is for income tax withholding. Now, if for some reason you have to pay, you have to collect withholding tax from a recipient because they didn't complete a W-9 form and give you an ID number. You're supposed to do backup withholding. If you did do backup withholding and collected it at 24%, then you need to report it on the 1099 miscellaneous. And it doesn't matter the dollar amount, so the vendor, the recipient, it could have been $200 that the customer or the recipient's invoice was for, and they didn't give you an ID number. You did backup withholding on the next invoice at 24%. You withheld that money from their payment, and then you have to report this. So maybe the total that that recipient received from you was $300 and you withheld $100, you'd still issue a 1099 for the $100 on here and include the $300 as their income, because you have to report the withholding. It doesn't matter the dollar amount. You always have to report the withholding. And then to remit those payments, you remit them on a 945 at the end of the year. And then there's box 5 is fishing boat proceeds. Haven't seen that. And then box 6, medical and healthcare payments. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the recipients, and we'll go into more detail, are individuals, partnerships, sole proprietors, and sometimes corporations. Well, this is one of the sometimes corporations. You issue a 1099 miscellaneous to all organizations, whether they're a corporation or not, if they've hit that $600 or more for services. In the payments for physicians, medical, healthcare services, this I typically see because organizations have drug testing done and they pay a vendor $700 for a variety of employees' drug testing. There's also for health accident and sickness payments would go in a 1099 miscellaneous box 6, but you would not issue a 1099 to a tax-exempt organization. Say you're paying a hospital, that they typically are tax-exempt, and so then you wouldn't, but a corporation you would. You also, in this instance, you would include the services and products together if you're paying for both. You total those up. Then box 7 is just a checkbox. This is for direct sales of $5,000 or more in a resale in a not a permanent establishment. So this isn't for a retail store vendor. This is more for a flea market, a trade show, things of that nature that aren't your permanent establishment. And you could have the checkbox marked plus an amount as far as earnings, the dollar amount if it was more than $600 or more. This is also for commissions, for buy, sell, or deposit on commissions. Those all are types of transactions that would fall under this. Box 8 is substitute payments in lieu of dividends or interest. Loan of customer securities is typically what goes under here. Box 9, this one I haven't seen either. Crop insurance proceeds, typically an insurance company to a farmer is an example. Now box 10, gross proceeds paid to an attorney. As I mentioned, there are a couple boxes for attorneys. This one is specifically for gross proceeds, not for legal services that you might pay to an attorney to draw up your organizing documents or to assist with a legal matter as far as bad debts are concerned or writing up any documentation like that. This is specifically for proceeds you pay to them regarding a settlement. And this is also one of the exceptions, again, for the corporations. You always issue a 1099 to an attorney, whether it's a corporation or a partnership, as long as it's $600 or more. Now, the next few boxes I have not used very much. 11 through 15, they are fish purchases, 409A. So the FATCA filing requirement is for foreign financial institutions. Golden parachute payments and non-qualified deferred compensation. Again, those I have not used too often. Some of these items, they're also on the W-2 potentially versus the 1099. But boxes 16 through 18 are very important because these are state information. Now for the IRS, these are not important boxes. They could be blank and the IRS won't give you a penalty or anything, but if you're required to file in the state, depending on the state that the service was performed, boxes 16 through 18 would be completed. Box 16 is the withholding amount, if any, that you had. Box 17 is the state code, like Wisconsin would be WI, it's the 2-digit abbreviation, plus your withholding number. And then box 18 is the amount of income for the services in that state. Now box 18 does not need to equal the other box that you have included on the form. So obviously if you have 5,000 in box 3 as other income, that isn't necessarily going to match box 18. Typically it would, but you could have multiple states where there's been earnings or services performed or of some sort, and then you'd have multiple states listed. On one 1099, you could have 2 states listed on one form. Now going back to the state ID number, if you don't have a withholding number because you don't have any wages and you don't have to do any state withholding, then you would, in Wisconsin, I should say, then there is a dummy with Wisconsin withholding number that is used, and it's a 036, lots of 8s, and a 01. Now, in other states, and again, you have to look at the different state rules, some states don't require a 1099 issue to them because they get the information from the IRS. Illinois is one example. So you have to look at where the services were performed and then decide which state needs to be filed. Wisconsin wants a copy of all 1099s, whether you did a withholding amount or not. So this is an example of the 1099, and we filled in a Wisconsin and a New York state payer ID number and state income tax. State income, there is no withholding, but there you can see that we have listed 2 states, and both of those equal the other income. Now, depending on the state services, typically this would be the example, or you could have, if the state didn't require a 1099, you might have Wisconsin listed with only 3,500 and nothing listed for another state. So now on to the 1099 NEC. There aren't as many boxes. There are only a few things that need to be included. Some of those items are repeated from the 1099 miscellaneous, but it is a very important box or form because this form, if you receive it or if you need to give it to the recipient, the income that's reported on here is subject to self-employment income tax. So that's the difference between the two forms as far as that goes. Also, this form needs to be to the IRS by January 31st and to the recipient by January 31st. So obviously, the non-employee compensation is everything that gets reported on this form in box 1, and it is for payments for services to someone who is not your employee. Obviously, your employee gets a W-2, and this is subject to self-employment tax. Again, it's in your trade or business, so I would not be issuing any 1099 NECs to anybody unless I had a business, accounting service business or some other service business, and it was in that business that I was giving them the 1099. But if somebody were just coming to paint my house, then I would not issue them a 1099. Typically, items that are reported in a 1099 NEC is professional fees, architectural fees, engineering fees, computer consulting fees, accounting services, any range of things, as long as they're not, again, your employee. Then you have commissions to salespeople. Prizes and awards for services performed by an individual who is not an employee, attorneys, directors, and compensation to independent contractors. It's kind of is a little bit redundant because a professional fees could be an independent contractor. But I guess you have expert witnesses, you have attorneys, again, those are what's reported here. And this attorneys is for services for legal fees. Again, these are legal fees that you have completed for the organizing document. You asked an attorney to assist with some bad debt documentation or anything like that where they're performing a service for you. It's not proceeds like $5,000 due to a lawsuit or something of that nature. Directors' fees, you have a board of directors for your corporation. They get $2,000 a year for the 4 annual meetings. They get a 1099 NEC for that. This does include incidentals. So if you have the architectural, you're paying for the architectural services, and those drawings that you received are incidental to the services, and so therefore it's all one package. Sometimes you might have an invoice and you have different things listed out on the invoice. You typically issue the 1099 for the whole invoice because everything is wrapped up. Now you have to remember, so you pay them $3,000, whether it's landscaping or architectural, and they do whatever these services are. You might get drawings, plantings, things of that nature in that whole, for that whole fee of $3,000. Well, they're going to report that as income, and then any of their expenses that they have, they're going to report as against that income to come to a net. So you don't want to just give them the $1,000 for the actual service and not for the plantings, if it's a landscaping, because you paid them $3,000. It's all included. They are supposed to report the $3,000, and then they obviously paid their vendor for the plantings as well. Unless you only paid them for the services and you paid somebody else for the trees or things like that. In here it does say prizes and awards for services performed. This would be a salesperson, but again, not your employee. You got to make that distinction because anytime you pay an employee, that would go on a W-2. And again, as you can see, it's attorneys, so therefore, that's one of the exceptions where you do still pay, provide a 1099. Items that might not be employee compensation and so not reported on a 1099, wages, bonuses, travel, allowances, all employee types of things. Typically an employee will receive a W-2. Now, there are some instances where you might have an employee that receives a W-2 and a 1099 if what they're doing for you is not in their job duty. So they could have multiple things. They could have a job duty as being an AP clerk, but then on the side, they run a snow plowing business. So then they come and plow your parking lot. Well, they're an employee for the AP clerk, but they're plowing your parking lot. You're going to give them a 1099 for that. In employees versus independent contractors, we have to look at the differences between an employee and an independent contractor. Who's got the control? It's a who, what, where, and how type of thing. Who the person is, do they do this for other people? How is this project going to be done? Is it on a times and, is it whenever they want, they can come and do the project, you just have a deadline. So you contract with them to get this project done. They have until November 10th to do the project. They can do it whenever they want, however they want. They just have to have a deadline of November 10th. They're an independent contractor. But if they need to be in the office from 8 to 5, or, it doesn't even have to be 8 to 5. There are some gray areas here, so you have to look at all the circumstances. You could just say they have a deadline, they work for you, they have these projects, this is their deadline, and they need to do them in the office, or this is the equipment they're using. So you have to look, and with this day and age, it's going to be a little harder, more challenging, because you can have employees that are remote, and you could have independent contractors that could potentially come into the office on occasion. I've seen various situations, so you have to look at each situation and determine who's got the most control. Because can they hire somebody to assist them and do the job? Do they do this for other people? Typically, that's how I see most of the cases where you can make an easier determination, but you do have to look at each situation. Now, why would the IRS really care? Well, if they're an employee, they can get all the taxes from the employer. If they're an independent contractor, that independent contractor is going to pay the IRS. Now, who's got the better option of pay? Who can be more readily able to pay? A company or a person being an independent contractor? Typically, the company has the ability to pay, and the IRS is going to get a little bit more because there's benefits that they have to pay for, potentially 401k, additional services. So the company would rather have them as an independent contractor. They don't have to pay for health benefits or anything like that. So again, this just goes over an independent contractor, and it's some little bit more information as to who has the right of control. And this chart kind of gives a little bit of potential differences. Again, there is a little bit more gray area, and as we're getting into remote working and things, there is a little bit, it can get gray, but you have to look at the circumstances that surround them. And sometimes it is also industry Depending on your industry, there might be types of people that do a certain type of position that are typically 1099 versus employees as well. Because you have some life insurance sales agents, they get a W-2, they are called, their classification as such, but sometimes they are 1099 employees, but you have to look at the industry as well. Now, if you didn't classify independent contractors or people as employees properly, you could reclassify them as employees by completing a voluntary classification settlement program. So you've treated a set of people, contractors, as independent contractors, and they should be employees. You decide that, you complete the form 8952, you complete it, you tell the IRS 60 days before you want to then classify them as employees. You don't pay now, you do pay later. You file it, you complete it, you end up having to pay only a portion of what you would have paid. So you don't have to pay it all for what you would have paid over the last year. But they do ask for, if you would, a penalty for not filing them as employees. But you also do have an audit protection that they are not going to audit this class of employees. Going forward, they will agree with you and away you go. But the one thing, there are certain eligibility requirements because you can't be under audit. You can't decide you want to do this because the IRS gives you an audit notice saying, hey, you misclassified people. But if you are under audit, there is a classification settlement program that the employer and the agent can come to some sort of terms. Kind of a middle ground, if you would. But for the, I've listed the eligibility requirements for this reclassification, and it's more or less that you've consistently reported these people as independent contractors for the last 3-5 years. I mean, you've done it consistently. You have filed all 1099s for this class of worker, and you're not under an employment audit, and you are voluntarily reclassifying them as employees. So that's the biggest box, is box 1. But then we have, again, a couple boxes that are repeats of the 1099 miscellaneous, so we're not going to go through the details again. Box 2 is that direct sales checkbox. That's also on the 1099 miscellaneous, because you could have independent contractor fees that you need to report. So then you report the fees and you check the box. Box 4 is the federal income tax withholding for that backup withholding. And then box 5 through 7 is the state information. Again, you have to look where the services are performed, and the same rules apply for the 1099 NEC as the miscellaneous. Then a couple boxes that are, again, the same for both is the account number and the telephone number. The telephone number box is a required number that needs to be on there. So you have to have on your 1099 a telephone number for the payor, so that if the recipient has questions, they know what number to call. The account number is something for your purposes as well as the IRS. If you receive a notice, and you have maybe more than one vendor that you've issued a 1099 for, they can distinguish which 1099 this notice relates to. That's all it is for. It's informational for that purposes. Sometimes people have vendor numbers they use in their accounting system, and they put those on there. Again, it's not a required box. Unless you have the FATCA reporting, which is the foreign filing for a U.S. payer of foreign financial income, and then you would check the box, and then you'd have to have an account number listed as well. Now, the second TIN notification box is a checkbox as well. This is an interesting one because if you have received an IRS notice regarding a specific vendor for multiple times, and it's multiple years in a row, and you've contacted the vendor, they've given you the W-9, they've completed it, you complete your 1099 the exact same way, they sign the W-9, you also get them to authorize it, and the IRS, for some reason, there's a misconnection. When you file it, you keep getting a notice for this one vendor year after year. Well, if you mark this box, the IRS will not send you another notice for that specific vendor. Now, you can't mark the box for all the vendors, even though we'd like to, because we don't want to receive any notices, but you have to, it's only if you've received multiple notices for the same vendor, you feel like you have the right number, but there's some misconnect there. Maybe it's a slight name change that doesn't match, I'm not sure. But I will say, one thing to do is there is a TIN matching program on the IRS website that could potentially avoid this. And we'll go over that in a minute. But what I did want to discuss is the payees that are required to receive the 1099s, because as I mentioned, it's individuals, sole proprietors, partnerships, and sometimes corporations. And as I went through, there were multiple times that I mentioned that corporations would receive a 1099. I have listed here all the boxes where you would issue a 1099 for the corporations, whether they're a corporation or not, they receive one as long as it's $600 or more. Government entities do not receive 1099s, and tax-exempt organizations do not receive them, but they would still issue them. So you would have potentially not-for-profit organizations issuing 1099s for services, but you would not issue a 1099 to a United Way for services or anything like that. So there's a few boxes that we want to discuss a little bit because the recipients is sole proprietors and individuals. These could be typically people doing business for themselves, and they file a 1040 with a Schedule C. There isn't a partnership return, there's no corporation return, but they're in the business for themselves. So typically you get a W-9 from them, it's listed as their name, they might have it doing business as, but their social security number. That's the important part. And so here's an example of a 1099 where you would have John Smith doing business as Smith Landscaping, and you can see the social security number is listed as the recipient's TIN. Now, this gets a little confusing because then we have LLCs who could be just a single member LLC, and they file a 1040 Schedule C. They still would be reported the exact same way. Doesn't matter if they have an LLC company and they have an employer ID number, it should still be listed as their individual name and social security number because the IRS is trying to match it with the form that they're filing. And if they're a single member LLC, they will be filing typically, unless they're filing an S corporation, they're filing a 1040 under their social security number. So then, again, you'd have James Jones doing business as Jones Bookkeeping LLC. Again, it's an LLC, but because it's a single member, meaning it's only one person that's running and owns this business, they have not elected an S corporation, they filled out the W-9 that they were sole proprietor, they should be filling it out with their social security number and their name, because that's what's going to match the IRS records. Jones Bookkeeping might match the IRS records if they have employees and they have withholding. It's not going to match the Wisconsin records, because Wisconsin does not see an ID number on any type of form filing for Jones Bookkeeping. When they file, they'll be filing a 1040 or a Wisconsin 1. They would not be filing a partnership return. But if they did, if it was multi-member LLC, I would file a partnership and I'd have a federal ID number, which is the 2 digits and the 7. So there's a distinction there, and the only reason I bring this up and I stress it is because there are so many misfilings, and you can get 1099 notices from the IRS because you're using a business name and you're using a social security number, or you're using a business name and an EIN number that they don't have on record because they have the individual's social security number and name as their business. So this is where a lot of the mismatching comes in and a lot of the notices come out, is because the W-9s aren't completed properly and the 1099s aren't completed properly. A corporation, here we used a law firm because they have to get issued a 1099. It's just the law firm's name and the recipient ID number. Fairly simple. There's not too many questions there. Sometimes there's some middleman 1099s that you have to issue, where you might have to you receive a 1099 and then you have to reissue them. So there are specific rules there. But then also, if you purchase a company or are purchased from another company buys you, there are some predecessor, successor rules. There's specific rules and information that the IRS needs to know so that they can match everything up, so that you avoid notices there as well. So we're going to kind of go through the requesting a recipient's TIN number. And so what that is the W-9. This is where most of the information comes from that you need to report on your 1099. And the one thing that is noted is that you can see that I can mark individual, sole proprietor, single member LLC, and that's where I need a social security number. But if they mark limited liability company, you have to, they have to mark if it's a C, S, or partnership. If they mark C or S, you would only file a 1099 for them if it's one of those exceptions. But if it's a partnership, you would always file a 1099 for them. So that's where the people need, when you get a W-9 from a vendor, you have to look at it. Does it make sense? Are they giving you their individual name and a doing business as name and a social security number? Or are they giving you an individual name, a business name, and an employer ID number? If they're giving you the employer ID number, they mark sole proprietor, an individual, you need to ask them for their social security number. I know people don't want to give their social security numbers out, but for matching purposes and for you to avoid notices, these really need to be completed properly for you to get your 1099s completed properly. And the signature is not required, but unless you've received IRS notices for it. And there is a penalty if they fail to file it. Obviously, you're supposed to do the backup withholding, but in the instructions, one thing to note is you could always highlight that they could get it's not big, but it's a $50 penalty for not completing it for you. And so sometimes I have people submit the instructions with it and highlight that and send it to them. You can get it from them via phone, fax, mail. What I would do too is if they're not giving you the W-9 completed, make notes of when you've called them, when you've mailed it, how you've done it, because if you're under audit, you can show them your file I faxed it to them, I called them on this day, I left a message with so-and-so, they were going to get it back to me, they did not. Because you want to make sure that you've met the due diligence of completing all the proper work. As I mentioned earlier, there's a 10 matching program that if you have a question, you will want to make sure that you match with the IRS, and you can go out to the irs.gov and put in TIN matching in the query, and that will get you to the program to sign up. There's a registration. Then you put in the vendor name and the number that they gave you, and it will tell you if it matches. It's not going to give you the number. So then let's just kind of go through briefly here. We have a few minutes as to when to file them. As I mentioned, the NEC is due to the recipients and to the IRS by January 31st. And the miscellaneous is due to the recipient by January 31st, but to the IRS by February 28th. Doesn't count if it's a leap year, February 28th. 29th, it's too late. Now, if you electronically file, which most people do, it's March 31st, typically. 2024, it'll be April 1st. And there are a couple exceptions to the rules. IRS loves their exceptions. And we've given a little bit here how to, if you have some, need some extensions, the federal will allow the extension for the 1099 miscellaneous, not the NEC. Typically, the IRS had 250 as their filing threshold. Starting January of 2024, and this is exactly how it says, the e-filing threshold falls to 10 returns. You have to electronically file them if the return is filed on or after January 1st of 2024, which matches the Wisconsin's 10, so you've always had to file them electronically for Wisconsin. And if you need to, you can go through the fire system. That's probably a good way to go. There's a couple ways to do it on the IRS website, but then I wanted to just mention the 1096, which is becoming manual because this is a manual form. You don't need it if you're filing electronically. I wanted to go to the corrections. There is a notice. So on the top of the 1099, you'll see whether it's miscellaneous or NEC, a void and a corrected box. Void is different than corrected. Void means the IRS won't read that form because there are multiple forms on one line, on one copy. So if you click the void box, it just skips over it. Corrected means it's replacing the old 1099. So you've had to have already received a 1099. If you have a corrected 1099, you need to put a date on it. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some penalties. They keep going up every year. This year, they start at $60 for each 1099. If you file them late, if you're missing a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of ID numbers, dollar amounts aren't correct. There's a wide range of reasons why you could have, but you have to have a lot of reasons to have a 1099. But if you file them late, these are the penalties, and it's by date. Some formatting. You want to make sure that if you don't have anything in a box, leave it blank. Don't put a 0. And there are some inconsequential errors that if you only have 1 out of 10 that maybe are wrong, they aren't going to give you a penalty. But a TIN number, a dollar amount, and a payer's surname are not considered inconsequential errors. Those are considered consequential. Some common errors are duplicate filings. If you did have any, you need to contact the IRS. You want to making sure the decimal point is in the correct place and that you have one. because otherwise the IRS will put it in there. These are all machine read forms or electronically submitted, so you want to make sure you're filing them properly. Just a little bit on retention. You should keep them for at least 4 years. Probably want to keep them for longer. And then wanting to make sure that you can submit them to the recipient with only the last 4 digits showing, but to the IRS you have to make sure all 9 digits are there. And then if you have any questions. Sorry, I had to run through the last part, but we're running through time. So does anybody have any questions?